everyone, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you personally. My name is Violeta Conde. I come from the Universidad de Salamanca in Spain, and I'm gonna present this work on modality and structure. Initially, I started to work in this paper or this talk alone, but then Professor Xavier Cumpa from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid joins me. So this is a joint work by Professor Xavier Cumpa and by me. And as I have said, the title is a provisional title on modality and structure. We have been thinking about changing it and calling it Can Modality Carve Up the Joints? So any feedback about this, about the title and about the whole presentation and the whole idea we are going to develop is very welcome. You have here our emails. You can write us anything, nothing more. I would like to thanks again you for watching this video. I would like to thank the organizers for having let me to have the opportunity of participating in this conference. So the line of the talk will be the following one. I will begin with an introduction where I will present the concept of naturalness as developed by David Lewis and the concept of structure as developed by Ted Sider. Then in the second part of the introduction, I will talk about the view that Sider defends about modality. He defends that modality is not fundamental. It's what he calls a Humean account of modality. We will see why. Then I will present what Sider considered criteria or tests for a structure, for something to be considered fundamental. He talks about empirical criteria, fundamentality criteria, and indispensability criterion. I will focus on fundamentality criteria or test, and I will explain each of them. We will defend that there are modal properties and modality in general can pass or fulfill this test, contrary to what Sider thinks, because he thinks that modality is not fundamental, so he thinks that modality cannot fulfill this test. These tests are completeness, purity, proportionality, absoluteness, determinanteness, and fundamentality. Finally, I will reply to some potentially objections, and I will finish with some final remarks or conclusions. So, the introduction, naturalness versus structure. Naturalness, as introduced by David Lewis, designates the features or properties that best carve nature at its joints. Of course, naturalness comes in degrees, insofar some properties are more natural than others. For example, the property being red is less natural than the property having wavelength of X. However, there are perfectly natural properties that are properties that carve nature at its joints perfectly. Naturalness applies to properties in the Lewisian framework, but what Siders make is to make the notion of naturalness to apply for other ontological categories and grammatical categories. So, a structure, as defined by Sider, is an extension and generalization of Lewisian naturalness. So, Sider says the question of joint carving can be raised for predicates, modifiers, sentential, connective, and expression of other grammatical categories. We will add later that we can apply the question of joint carving to modal operators too. So therefore, naturalness is a proper subset of structure in this view. First, before telling you why Sider considered modality to be non-fundamental, I will describe a perspective or a position called modal primitivism or modalism that argues that modal facts about what is possible or necessary, cannot be reduced to or explained in terms of not modal facts. This position, it has been defended by several philosophers like Williamson, Timothy Williamson, Louis de Rosette, and Ottavio Bueno and Skolczakowski, among others. I myself, in my doctoral dissertation, defend this view. I consider myself a modalist, So in what follow, that will be important. So we have here Hume. Sider rejects modalism in virtue of consideration of ideological economy. Modal truths will not be grounded in a reducible modal feature of reality, but will be instead derivative of non-modal facts, combined with certain semantic of ideological choice. He says, the core idea of the Humean account then is that necessary truths are truths of certain more or less arbitrarily selected kinds. More carefully, begin with a set of modal axioms and a set of modal rules. Modal axioms are simply certain chosen true sentences. Modal rules are certain chosen truth-preserving relations between sets of sentences and sentences. So, as we have said, as I have said, modal axioms are considered in virtue of some ideological economy. So it's not that they are fundamental, but we talk in these terms because we think if we do that, we will have ideological economy. Then we have Sider's criteria for structure, and we have that he thinks that there are empirical criteria for something to be considered fundamental, to be considered structural in Sider's terms. And we have similarity, confirmations, explanations, and law of natures, inductions, reference, and physical geometry. Then we have fundamentality criteria. This will be the criteria we will focus on. So we have completeness, purity, subproportionality, absoluteness, determinateness, and fundamentality. And finally, we have an indispensability criterions. This criterion could be summed up in this sentence. X is a structure if X meets an indispensability criterion, namely to be indispensably believe in our best theory of the world. Sider says, the Quinian thought about ontology is sometimes put in terms of indispensability, belief in the entities that are indispensable in your best theory. The analogous thought about ideology may be similarly put, regardless you carving the ideology that is indispensable in your best theory. This is fine provided indispensable is properly understood as meaning, cannot be jettisoned without sacrificing theoretical virtue. So what we are going to do in what follows is to defend that there are some modal properties. In particular, we will proceed with an example, the example of being gold, or better, the property of having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus, as an heuristic tool to demonstrate that modality could pass this test, or at least to argue that modality can pass this test that Sider considered to be fundamental, to consider something fundamental, to be a little bit redundant. So we have completeness. Sider says the fundamental must be complete, that is, it should be responsible for everything. Therefore, every non-fundamental truth or property should rely or hold in virtue of some fundamental truth or property. Modalist interprets this in virtue of in terms of necessity. For instance, if A is true, then necessarily B is true. What the modal relations show is not only what must be the case, but rather how the world could not be different once the fundamental level is fixed. What is true in virtue of the fundamental fact is not merely continually true, but necessarily true. Let's think about the counterpart or the modal property, the non-modal property, having 79 protons in the nucleus. If having 79 protons in the nucleus is a fundamental property, then the fact that something is gold cannot be a merely contingent consequence of that properties. Once the fundamental facts are fixed, it cannot be left open whether an object with 79 protons is gold. For this reason, the property having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus, the modal properties, appears to better satisfy Sider's requirement of completeness. It directly reflects the way in which the fundamental level fully and subjectively fixes the rest of reality. Then we have purity. Sider says, let's think a little bit more about purity and in particular how it relates to forms of primitivism. Consider the doctrine of modalism, which I understand as the claim that necessity is a fundamental notion, in my terms, carves out the joints. Now, many modalists will, I think, take a step further and say also that modal truths are fundamental truths. But given purity, it cannot be that all modal truths are fundamental. The modal truth that is necessary that all cities are cities, for example, must be non-fundamental. Given purity, see, it is involved the non-fundamental notion of cityhood. Okay, that's true, but the restrictions either imposed does not rule out all modal facts from fundamentality. It merely constrains which modal claims can qualify. So we have no problem with this test. So the relevant physical predicate and the modal operator necessarily should be specified in the fundamental vocabulary to be considered fundamental. A more careful formulation of goals should be provided, like having necessarily such and such fundamental entities arranged in such and such a way. As I have said, maybe having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus is just heuristic. It cannot be the fundamental property, but I don't mind. The fundamental property could be this one, having necessarily such a fundamental entities arranged in such and such way. But it's just heuristics. But here the problem is that the modal operator, the necessity box, should be addressed as fundamental. Other way, the argumentation would be circular. Something is fundamental because the necessity operator is fundamental. In the same vein, the quantifiers are said to be indispensable for structures. Modal operator could be said to be indispensable. The claim that modal vocabulary may be fundamental is not assumed but motivated by this explanatory indispensability in scientific and metaphysical theorizing. If laws, dispositions, and kind identities cannot be articulated with a modal resource, then ideological economy does not justify eliminating the modality. We will see later the concept of phase space and fitness. But we can also here appeal to additional empirical tests like similarity and law of natures inside their own terms in support of the fundamentality of the property of having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus. Sider says, consider three objects, two electrons in identical intrinsic states and a cow. It is the most natural thing in the world to say that the electrons are perfectly similar to each other, and that neither is perfectly similar to the cow. The three objects should be divided into two groups, one containing the electron, the other containing the cow. The electrons go together and neither goes with the cows. For many, this similarity criterion is the only handle they have on Lewisian naturalness, but is inapplicable to quantifier and sentential connectives, for example. Quantifiers and sentential connectives aren't shared, nor do they have the instance, so we can assess whether they share it makes for qualitative similarity of whether the set of their instances are highly miscellaneous. But he says, next we must change our focus from object similarity to fact similarity. The connection between similarity and structure in the case of the existential quantifier should be understood thus. Is existential quantification carves out the joints, then whenever too far an existential fact, that is a genuinely similarity between them. The fact that there is a donkey and the fact that there is an electron are genuinely similar in that cheese and existential fact. In the same vein, we can say, well, first, on the one hand, the property of having 79 protons in the nucleus, the non-modal property, seems to meet two empirical criteria that are fundamental for a property to come as structural. It explains why something is called, and it accounts for the relevant similarities among instances. On the other hand, the modal operator also seems to satisfy the similarity test for facts developed by Sider. The fact that there is possible a donkey and the fact that there is possible an electron are genuinely similar insofar as this is a modal fact. So together, having 79 protons in the nucleus, the modal operator, I don't know, I don't remember the word, but give us the modal property of having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus. Together, it means purity. Subproportionality. Structures is located at a subpropositional level. It does not concern complete propositions, but rather their constituents, predicates, properties, relations, objects, and quantifiers, such as existential quantifier. Here the focus is on the remodality, which concerns objects and the property rather than entire propositions. So because of that, we can say that also modality meets subproportionality. Absoluteness. Whether or not an object has the property of having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus does not depend on how we describe the world, on our classificatory practice, or on any pragmatic considerations. It depends solely on the object's fundamental constitution and on how that constitution fixed what the object could and could not be. If the non-modal property having 79 protons in the nucleus is perfectly natural, then given the fundamental role of modality in fixing what is possible, the modal property having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus inherits the same claim to absoluteness. The property either applies or it does not, independently of our theoretical interest or representational choice. Moreover, absoluteness is not susceptible to further explanation, and this property is not either. Determinateness. A property is determinate if there are clear conditions under which it applies or fails to apply. The property having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus is determinate in this sense. There is no vagueness concerning whether an object has exactly 79 protons, nor concerning whether this number could vary while the object remains the same kind of thing. An object either has this number of protons as a matter of necessity or it does not. And finally, fundamentality is the necessity of the property having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus in question is genuinely structural, then this modality must itself belong to the fundamental level. So, some objection, nomological versus metaphysical modality. We adopt a necessitarian approach, that is an approach that defends that nomological modality entails metaphysical modality. The argument we use is counterfactual robustness, laws of nature, and empirical test for structure should be necessary truth. We can describe counterfactual robustness as follows. We can describe the feature as follows. If it is allowed that if are G, then this generalization will still have been true if there have been more F than there actually are, or since some F had found themselves in conditions different from the one that actually obtained. Counterfactual robustness therefore implies that laws of nature are necessarily like they are, given that the modal property in question is necessarily so. There could not be two worlds with the same property and different law. Because of that, nomological modality collapses with metaphysical modality. Given that the modal property in question is necessarily so, there could not be two worlds with the same property and different laws, unless either follows a model with nomological necessity. The criterion is not good enough. A collapse into essentialism, another potential objection. Essence should be understood as a source of necessity with defense. Necessity truths are explained by truths involving essence or laws precisely because essence and law stand in the sort relationship to necessity. So it's not that we are collapsing into essentialism when, say, having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus is being essentially God. But that essence should be understood as a sort of necessity. And finally, depending on S5, of course, there are more objections, but these are the three we have identified that we think that are more important. If one adopts, for example, a modal logic such as S5 together with the Barkham formulae, modalities are not vary from word to word. What's necessary is necessary, and what is possible possible. In this sense, modality sense is not contingent. See, for example, Williamson in his book Modal Logic and Metaphysics. But even weaker modal logics like T or S4 suffice for the necessity of determination and the stability of essential properties or position does not depend on S5. Final remarks. By applying Sider fundamentality tests to the red modal properties, we have tried to show that at least some modal properties, such as having necessarily 79 protons in the nucleus, can plausibly satisfy the criteria of completeness, purity, proportionality, absoluteness, determinateness, and fundamentality. If this is correct, then Sider human treatment of modality is overly restrictive. While many modal notions may fail to qualify as fundamental, this does not warrant the wholesale exclusion of modality from structure. On the contrary, some modal properties appear indispensable for capturing the explanatory role that structure is supposed to play. We have other examples that maybe it could pass Sider tests. Siders claim that modality plays no role in fundamental inquiry, can be challenged taking into account other scientific concepts. Phase space, for example, as referred by Williamson, a phase space is a multidimensional space in which points represent a distinct possible state of a physical system, defined in terms of all admissible values of position and momentum. It's a concept that belongs to foundational physics, and we can say, or we can wonder, is this perfectly natural? Maybe yes, and it's a modal concept. And the same with fitness. Fitness is not simply a record of reproductive success, but a measure of an organism's propensity to survive and reproduce across a range of possible environmental conditions. Fitness tends to involve counterfactual and dispositional consideration, and does appear to be a reducible model. It belongs to foundational biology, so we can wonder, it is perfectly natural? Maybe also phase space and fitness could pass Sider test for modality, for structure. And that's all. These are the reference. Thank you very much for your attention. Spasiba. We are very excited about receiving feedback and questions. Thank you.